A Demon in the Darkness by Daniel Reckert. Part 1. Fields of Slaughter. Dark, lifeless eyes stared upward into the endless blue of a cloudless sky, indifferent to the glaring rays of the dying sun or the swarms of flies lapping at the moisture lingering in their corners. The crows would soon come to take those eyes, and then the jackals would come for the rest. It was the inevitable fate of all who lived the life of war, and Valen had no illusions that he too will someday taste that fate, but it hadn't been today. The Transoxanian horde had come marauding from the vast western plains, destroying everything in their path. They crossed the Transox River at the onset of winter and established themselves on its eastern banks. From there, they burned trading posts along the river, pillaging caravans, stealing women, and killing anyone who resisted. They ravaged the eastern tribes, sending many fleeing northwards to shelter below the city walls of Kos. As was traditional to their style of warfare, the horde leaders sent an emissary to the city-state, declaring their intention to attack, and demanding they surrender or face utter annihilation. This was a threat not taken lightly by Kos's self-styled emperor, Valamordran. The emperor was already feared throughout the region. It was whispered among the plebs, freemen, and slaves alike that the emperor was a magic user, and this horde of steppe demons was divine punishment. But even in spite of these rumors, the patricians and senators of Kos held a very sober fear of their self-proclaimed emperor. If not because of his supposed consortium with devils, it was the mysterious disappearance of his own family and the brutal deaths of every one of his political rivals. The emperor gave no response. He merely returned the horde's emissary without his eyes or tongue. The order was issued for the sons of Kos to take up arms in her defense, and every mercenary in the city-state's territory was contracted by the Senate. Even the wild horsemen of the eastern tribes rallied under Kos's banner. The army was officially led by a prominent senator named Mal Evangelos, who had bought the position 2 years ago from its previous occupant. A haughty elder statesman out for political clout, Evangelos was far more inclined to drinking wine and fondling his slaves than actually leading anyone. He lived out of an enormous pavilion while in the field, and rarely ventured beyond its thresholds. This left the actual responsibility of leading the army in the hands of lesser men. Evangelos only took up the facade of general while he was within the inner walls of Kos, taking credit for some victory he had no part in winning. The true leader of Kos's army was the captain general of the city's mercenaries, who went by the name of Valen. He was a barbarian in a foreign land, hailing from the savage and bleak wildlands north of the despotate of Rictus. Famous as a sellsword and adventurer, Valen was also notorious as a pirate, a renegade, and a firebrand. While Evangelos was guzzling wine and groping his slaves, Valen strategized with his officers and the leaders of his tribal allies. While Evangelos was fussing over his gaudy general's attire and sleeping in a luxurious tent, Valen was sitting around campfires every night with his men, eating from the same cooking pots they did. He rode with the tribal cavalry on scouting missions and stood shoulder to shoulder with the militia as they drilled and marched. When the Transoxanians finally began moving in the spring, Valen and the warriors of Kos were ready for them. Valen's forces numbered a little over 20,000, nearly half of which was composed of mounted tribal horsemen and mercenary heavy cavalry. The rest was mostly made up of Kos's citizen militia, men who fought in the traditional Gaian fashion in tight phalanxes bristling with spears. Fortunately, they also had some southern archers recruited from the rugged coastlands, tough and hardy men of mixed blood who were accustomed to defending their flocks and fishing boats with deadly bronze-headed arrows. They'd be desperately needed to counter the Transoxanian horse archers. Valen positioned the army on the crest of a sloping hill, with the militia formed up in series of tight squares. On their flanks, he positioned his southern archers, protected by stakes and wicker shields. Valen hoped their concentrated fire would prevent the militia from being encircled. Behind the militia, Valen positioned his mercenary heavy cavalry, which frustrated many of the young and impetuous in their ranks. But the veterans trusted Valen completely, and they silenced any grumbling from newcomers. On his far flanks, Valen positioned his tribal allies, who were all mounted and armed in a similar fashion to their rivals from across the river. They wore little armor, but they could move across the grasslands with the speed of a rising storm. Dust clouds rose over the horizon, stirred up by the hooves of thousands of horses. The Transoxanian horde advanced rapidly, an army of around 30,000 to Valen's estimates, all of whom were mounted on swift-moving, half-wild steppe ponies, and armed with bows, spears, war clubs, long axes, and deadly curved sabers. They charged in large waves, howling like blood-mad animals and clashing their weapons on horsehide shields. The militia was undaunted and held formation, even as arrows dinted their armor and helmets. They hoisted their shields, braced their spears against the ground, and mumbled desperate prayers between gritted teeth. The charge shattered upon the phalanx like a wave on a rocky shore. Horsemen were hurled from their saddles to be trampled and crushed under their former mounts. Frenzied fighting broke out where the formation cracked, but the footmen of Kos swiftly reformed ranks, killing many horsemen trapped behind their new lines. Unfazed, the first group of Transoxanians fell back, and a second charged home, as fearless and reckless as the first. They attacked the militia like this over and over again, but couldn't shatter their formations. From Valen's perspective, it looked like a man trying to break a boulder with his bare fist. After several attempts, the heaps of dead and dying men and horses became too big of an obstacle for the horsemen to overcome, so they fell back and changed their tactics. The Transoxanians returned quickly, riding back and forth in front of the militia in a massive moving circle, peppering them with arrows and scouring for any weaknesses in their defense. Some horsemen broke off and attempted to outflank the militia, but were driven back by murderous volleys of Valen's southern bowmen. They charged at the archers, but their horses floundered at the stakes, stumbled and shied away, making their riders easy targets. The horde was becoming more and more frustrated after every failed attack. The confidence and aggression that once held them together now worked against them. The horde was losing its solidity, becoming increasingly disorganized and spread out. Valen noticed many of the horde's chiefs arguing furiously with one another from horseback. Their cohesion was faltering, and they started to fall back. Now, Valen thought, now is the time. Valen raised his hand, and a dozen trumpets sounded simultaneously.